Quick, say something.
We're funny.
Yeah, we're funny, and we're very, very capable, each in our respective ways. I'm a capable fruitcake. Roland is a capable grown-up. This is the difference between us. But also, we are both absolutely nuts about what we do. And that always helps. One of the best things about being at a convention, as opposed to being at one of the corporate gigs that we sometimes get to do, or one of the media gigs that we sometimes get to do, is at a convention, we're talking to people who are also nuts about what we're nuts about. And that's fantastic. Because if you've ever had the experience of sitting down in a studio full of very highly paid, suited and booted individuals and trying to explain the basics of a whole culture to them, you will know it's not always fun and it's not always easy. But talking to you guys is just a thrill ride because you get us. You get what we're about, and that's fantastic. Right, should we give it a little bit longer?
Yeah, let's get started. So I'm going to... first of all, as many of you know, I'm sure, because Helen has been here before.
No, this is my first A-Fest.
Oh, I'm sorry. You've been to Dallas before.
I've been to Dallas before. 19 ACONs in.
Sorry.
Thank you. But this is my first AnimeFest. I know this hotel, too, because ACON was here till 5 years ago. So, yeah, well, I knew it before they rebuilt the ground floor. That's difficult.
Anyway, Helen has written a number of books, contributed to... what's it called, the Encyclopedia of Anime, right? Mm-hmm. Which is a comprehensive book with Jonathan Clements that they wrote together.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Ginger kindly brought one with her because she knew I always forget them. That's a really old one, the Anime Movie Guide. I did that about 25 years ago. Much as that. Thank you. But the Anime Encyclopedia, as Roland says, has been my dream book ever since I wanted to write a book about anime. 1,100,000 words on the history of anime from around 1917 to the present day. But now we've got a new revision to do, so there's a lot of work in there.
It's an extraordinary document. If you're really into anime, it's got everything in it, and often very funny write-ups on each of the films and series that it addresses. So it's worth your time. Helen has also written an extraordinary book about Hayao Miyazaki, the most famous figure at Studio Ghibli in Japan, probably the most famous Japanese animator in the world, I would say.
Almost certainly the most famous Japanese animator in the world, yeah.
And I wrote this book called Japan America, which is really traces the roots of Japanese popular culture, especially as it became well known in the United States. So it's sort of the story post-World War II of Osamu Tezuka and Disney and how this whole hybrid art form exploded into Western markets, largely, as you know, probably in the late 1990s with Pokemon and Dragon Ball Z and, of course, Sailor Moon on television. Those particular titles really led to the expansion of anime around the world, and, of course, Miyazaki himself being a big part of that with My Neighbor Totoro, and then eventually Spirited Away, which won the Academy Award. This is unusual for a Japanese animated film to win an Academy Award. So that's what Japan America is about. But here, we are together to talk about the other genius at Studio Ghibli, the director Isao Takahata. And how many of you have seen Takahata's work, whether it's Grave of the Fireflies or Pompoko? Okay,
oh,
great. So you're familiar with who he is. So I'm going to pass the baton to Helen because she's going to introduce Takahata and his role at Studio Ghibli.
Yeah, as you probably know from if any of you have seen me speak before, my real interest and passion is anime as a construct, as a place where you put stories, and how those stories are processed from all over the world into Japanese sensibility, and then filtered out again into the sensibility of everyone who loves anime all over the world. Roland is absolutely superb on the business side and the what one might call the harder edge skills. I suppose we're hard and soft skills complementing. But both of us are very, very interested by Ghibli because Ghibli is a remarkable artifact in its own right. In fact, Studio Ghibli is almost a fourth person in a triangular relationship. And what we've got now is the interesting situation where one of the creators of that studio has gone, literally. Not like Miyazaki saying, I'm retiring ever since Porco Rosso and then coming back. Takahata has died. And this seems like a good point to assess him and assess who he was, what he did. Now you can see him there 4 years ago at Annecy, receiving an award at the prestigious International Film Festival. Nice old guy, suit, just what you'd expect. Oh, that is so not Takahata. He scrubbed up, put on a suit, and was made to go and do the corporate thing as rarely as possible. He is very much a man who plowed his own furrow. And if we do a little bit of background for those of you who don't know him, which may be interesting thinking about him later, he was the youngest of 7 children and the 3rd boy in the family. And he came from a good upper middle class family. His dad was a high school principal who went on to be the chief of education for the whole of their prefecture. So he came from a family with good educational expectations. But as the youngest child and the youngest boy, the pressure on you to conform to family stuff is somewhat less. He went to university and studied French literature, and this remained a passion of his. But also at university, at Tokyo U, which is a really prestigious university, and which tells you that Takahata had a very fine brain to get in there, he saw a French movie called Le Roi et l'Oiseau, The King and the Mockingbird. And this struck him so powerfully that he thought, I would like to work in that medium. I would like to be able to steer stories that plant ideas in people's head the way that story has planted ideas in mine. But he knew he wasn't interested in being an animator. He wasn't interested in the, as it were, visual side, except as a vehicle for story. So here he was, joining Toei straight from university, qualifying to get into their assistant director program, didn't care at all about being an animator. As far as he was concerned, the whole thing is in service of the message, and as the writer-director, he was going to control the message. He had an amazing stroke of luck at Toei. He was taken under the wing of Yasuo Otsuka, who was one of their experienced directors, and the two of them bonded because they were both socialists. They both had very strong loyalty to the union, and they also both saw animation as a vehicle for putting across ideas. And when he'd been with Toei about 4 years, he met Hayao Miyazaki. And eventually, of course, he and Miyazaki, with Toshio Suzuki and Yasuyoshi Tokuma, who owned the Tokuma studio, would go on to form Studio Ghibli. Now, if you look at Takahata's filmography, it looks fairly small. And this is because for nearly 20 years, much of his work was in TV. And if you have a look on Wikipedia, there's a long listing of TV series that it would be profitable to explore in the years before he did Ghibli. He was at Toei till 1971, then he knocked around TV quite a bit, and then he directed 5 movies at Studio Ghibli. The 6th movie, Hull's Prince of the Sun, The Little Norse Prince, is the movie that took him out of Toei. He directed it, Miyazaki worked on it, they were passionate about it, it tanked. It tanked so embarrassingly that although Toei didn't sack him, he was never going to get another chance to direct there. So he knew he couldn't stay there. It didn't tank because it was a bad movie. It tanked because it was not properly promoted, not properly marketed, and put on for a very short season in one cinema. So it never had a chance. But Takahata knew that he would never have a chance, so he moved on. At Ghibli, he directed Grave of the Fireflies, Only Yesterday, Pompoko, My Neighbors the Yamadas, and The Princess Kaguya. And he also did short films and contributions to anthology films during this period. And as a producer, he produced Nausicaa and Laputa and Michael Dudek's Tale of the Red Turtle. And most interestingly for me, because it was something I never expected of him, he was musical director on Kiki's Delivery Service. He was instrumental in Kiki in other ways. He was a great fixer. And he went out to Yamato Takubin, the delivery service, who give the cat logo to delivery service, and talked them into not suing Ghibli if they called the movie Kiki no Takubin, Maho no Takubin, which is delivery service, and allowing them to have a black cat despite the similarities with the logo. So Takahata was a fixer. Takahata was a wheeler dealer. Takahata was capable in all sorts of ways that don't emerge if you just look at his filmography. But what Takahata mostly was, according to Hayao Miyazaki, was a lazy great sloth. Miyazaki was infuriated by the fact that Takahata, who was one of the most gifted filmmakers he had ever met, just couldn't be bothered to do things that he wasn't engaged with, didn't believe that deadlines were significant if you hadn't got it perfect, didn't believe in the importance of getting something out on time. Takahata was a man who lived by nobody else's timetable. He would work on a project till he regarded it as ready, and only then would he consent to it being marketed. This made him a great filmmaker, but a complete nightmare for the studio. Now, I don't know if any of you have seen the documentary Kingdom of Dreams and Madness. How many here? A few, but I would urge the rest of you to go and see it, because it's a remarkable piece of filmmaking in its own right. Mami Tsunade has done a great job, but it tells you more about Studio Ghibli than anything else will. Those three guys that you see there, Suzuki, the fixer, looking straight at the camera. Suzuki is always looking straight to camera. When you see a picture of Suzuki, he is aware of everything in the room. He is a great salesperson. He is a great organizer. And without him, Ghibli would not have survived. Miyazaki, wearing his apron and with that little downcast look, could almost be a schoolgirl. You know, I'm not really sure what I'm doing here, so I'm kind of, you know, I'm just in my work gear. And Takahata doesn't give a stuff. Takahata is not looking at the camera. Takahata is not assuming a pose. He's got interested in something off left of shot, and he's watching that. And that picture tells you so much. And I think once she had that shot, Tsunade had the direction to edit her movie. She knew where she was going with it. But what about these? These are pictures of the old Miyazaki and Takahata, as Miyazaki liked to present himself in his later life, as the artisan, standing there with a hatchet in his hand. Actually, when I interviewed him, he said to me, you know, if Takahata and I are working on a film together, there is blood on the walls. We have so many differences of opinion. We have so many differences of approach. We fight each other every inch of the way, and the result is a much better movie. So maybe that's a really telling picture. Takahata is standing there, hands in pockets, couldn't care less. Miyazaki is standing there with a hatchet, thinking, what do I have to do to get this guy to move the movie in my direction? The other pictures, though, are pictures of two much younger people, people who were both active in the Animators Union at Toei, people who both had a dream about how they wanted to move the animation industry forward, how they wanted to make their own work. And when you look back at early pictures of Miyazaki and Takahata, two of the interesting things are they are always engaged with each other. They are profoundly engaged with each other. Each found the other the most interesting filmmaker he'd ever worked with, but each also found the other the best friend he'd ever made. And the importance of Takahata to Miyazaki, I think, is only going to emerge now Miyazaki no longer has him. Miyazaki on Takahata. Roland, would you like to run that clip?
Sure.
I don't know. We've taken a clip from YouTube of Miyazaki giving a eulogy at Takahata's memorial service. I don't know if we're actually going to get any English language feedback with this. We can.
Yeah, lower the lights.
Can we lower the lights? Yeah. And if we don't get subtitles, I'll read you some extracts from what he said. Can you all see? Now, are we going to get the subtitles? Let's see.
How do I maximize this?
I mean, just watching the video will give you the emotion the man is feeling.
How do I maximize this?
It hasn't got the usual little dongle in the corner, has it?
No.
Oh, there, well
There
done.
we go. Let's see if we get sound.
If
We're
we-
competing with anime music videos next door.
Yeah.
マクさんというあだ名の言われはですね、まあ定かで
No,
ない
we
部分
don't
もあ
have
るんですが、大
And
体
we
も
don't
の
have
すごく朝を
subtitles.
苦手な男でして、
Oh, we do.
東映動画に勤め始めた
But
時
watch
も
him and watch
ギリ
his
ギリ書き
face.
込むというのが毎日でございまして、 買ってきたパンをタイムカードを押してからパクパクと食べて
He's talking about how
水道の
Takahata
蛇口から
got his
そのまま
nickname
水を飲んでいたという
Paku-san, Mr. Munch,
それで
because he would always race into work at the last minute,
噂です
gulping water and munching the bread he'd brought with him as soon as he
水
punched
筒
his
分
time
という
clock.
形ではありませんが
So they called him
帰
Paku-san.
ってきましたものを読ませていただきます
And Miyazaki is talking with such
パクさんは
affection and such
95
humility
歳ま
about
で生きると思い
the
込んで
fact
い
that
た
Takahata's daughter told him 9 years, doctor told him 9 years before
自分にも
to
あま
stop
り時間がないんだ
Takahata
なと思い
smoking. Because he
9年
said,
前私たちの主治医か
"You're
ら電話が
serious?
入っ
If
た
you're his friend, talk him into
友
giving
達
up
なら
smoking."
高畑監督のタバコをやめさせなさい
Suzuki-san and I sat across from
真剣な声だった
Paku-san at a table.
主治医の迫力に恐れを
I
な
was
して
sitting
僕
straight
と
up.
鈴木さんは
That was my
鈴木
first
さんというの
time
はプロデュー
talking
サ
to
ー
him
で
this
す
way.
パクさんとテーブルを挟んで向かい合った
Quit
姿勢
smoking,
を正し
please,
て
I
話すなん
said.
て初めてのこ
Please
と
quit smoking for the
パク
sake
さん
of
タバコを
work.
やめてくださいと僕は
Suzuki-san said,
仕事を
"We've
す
been
るために
prepared
や
for
め
a
てください
flood of
これは
excuses
鈴
and
木さん
objections."
弁解やら反論が怒涛のように吹き出てくると思っていたのにあ
And
りがとうご
eventually
ざ
he
いま
gave up
す食べ
smoking
ます
for real,
パクさん
completely.
はきっぱり言って頭を下げた
Once I came up to him and
そして本
intentionally
当に
smoked
パ
a
クさんはタ
cigarette.
バコをやめてしまった
He said, "I think it smells
僕はわ
good,
ざとパクさんの
but
そ
I've
ばへタバ
grown
コを
not
吸い
to
に行っ
crave
た
cigarettes at all."
いい匂いだと
He
思
was
うよ
in a
でも
different
全然吸い
league
たく
than
なく
me
なっ
as
た
a
パ
man.
クさん彼の方が役者
I
が上だったの
realized
で
he would surely live
や
until
っぱり
95
95
years
歳まで生
old
きてき
after
た
all.
だなと僕は本当に思いました
Miyazaki talks about the day
1963
they first met.
パクさ
He
んが27
remembers
歳
in
僕が
absolute
22歳の
detail
時僕
the
らは初
first
めて出会い
moment
ま
of
した
his meeting with Takahata.
その初めて言葉を交わした日のこ
In
とを今でもよく
1963, we
覚えて
first
いま
met
す
each other.
黄昏の時
Paku-san
の
was
達成で
27,
僕は練馬行
and
き
I
のバ
was
スを待ってい
22
た
back then.
雨上がりの
I
水
still
溜りの
remember
元
the day
頂
we
上一人の
exchanged
青
words
年
for
が
the
近づい
first
て
time. I was waiting for the bus bound for Nerima at
穏
a
やか
bus
で
stop
賢そうな青
in the
年の顔が
twilight.
目の前にあった
Remember that scene in
それが高
Totoro
畑勲
where the girls
勲
wait at
と
a bus
パクさ
stop
ん
in
に
the
出会った瞬
twilight?
間だった
A young man approached me walking
55
down the
年前の
street
ことなのに
where some
なんでは
puddles
っきり覚え
remained
ているのだろう
after it
あの
rained.
時のパクさんの
Remember
顔
that
を
scene in
今もありあ
Totoro?
りと思い出す
I heard you meeting up with
次
Sego
にパクさんに出会った
Takuro-san.
のは東映動画
In
労働
front of
組合
me
の
was the
役員に
gentle
押し出され
and
てしまった時
wise-looking
だった
face of a young man.
パクさんは副委員長
That was the
僕は
moment
副長
when I
にされて
first
しまっ
met
ていた
Takahata-san.
緊張で
also
発見に
known
苦
as
しむような日
Paku-san.
々が始まった
I wonder,
それでも組合事務所
why
の
do I
部
still
外に泊ま
remember
り込ん
that
で
this
僕はパクさん
clearly,
と夢中に語り明かし
even
た
though it was
ありとあら
55
ゆる
years
こと
ago?
中での作品について
I can even vividly remember the look on his face at that time.
もっと遠くへもっと
The
深く
next time I saw Paku-san was when I was pushed into being a member of the board of the Toyodoga Labor Union.
何を作ればいい
Before we
の
knew
か
that, he was put in to be the vice chairman, and I was put in to be the secretary general.
パクさんの
I
教
was
養は
struggling with the
圧倒
days
的
where
だ
I was sick to my stomach
僕は
because
得
of
難い人に
pressure.
巡り合え
I
たの
would
だと
stay
確
over
か
in the shack that was the union office and be absorbed in talking with Paku-san until dawn
僕らは
about
精一杯あの時
everything,
生きたんだ
especially our work.
久おらなか
We
った
were
パク
never
さんの姿勢は
satisfied
僕
with
ら
our
のもの
work.
だったんだ
We wanted to
あり
go
がとう
further and deeper. We wanted to work for something we could really be proud of, but we didn't know what we should make or how.
あの
His
雨上がりの達
literacy
成で声をかけ
really
てくれ
blew
た
my
パクさん
mind.
のことを忘れない
I was so glad that I got to encounter a man of such rare intellect. I think we can see from that Miyazaki's affection for Takahata was enormous, but also that his respect for this guy was enormous. Takahata really was his senpai. That relationship in Japanese schools and companies where an older worker takes you under their wing and becomes closer to you than their brother, they actually had that. That was how he felt about Takahata. 55 years ago, I'll never forget the first time you talked to me at the bus stop after it rained. Thank you very much. That was so beautiful. And seeing that, it made me seriously consider what I think that Takahata had done for Ghibli, but also what he'd done for Miyazaki. In a very real sense, there would have been no Hayao Miyazaki movies without Isao Takahata. So what we thought we'd like to do is show you a few clips of movies that Takahata made and talk about the fantastic way that he handles time, the fantastic way that he handles reality, and the depth that he puts into even simple scenes. And Roland, would you like to tell how we both chose this one, independently of each other, this first clip?
Yeah. I, first of all, How many of you have seen Grave of the Fireflies? Okay. So it's one of the rare films that I personally consider a masterwork. And what I mean by that is that I almost think that there's nothing out of place in that film. That everything from the music, as you know, there's incredibly beautiful soundtrack to the film, a lot of it featuring harpsichord. The pacing of the film, the storytelling, and again, this is entirely subjective, my opinion, but I've always felt that if I put the two side by side, Miyazaki and Takahata, I feel that Takahata's native skill for storytelling is superior to Miyazaki's. I think Miyazaki is a great fantasist, and I also think sometimes when I'm watching his films that he sometimes rushes. He gets ahead of himself in his enthusiasm to move off into the fantastical world, and sometimes it feels a bit forced to me. Whereas with Takahata, at his best, I feel like there's almost nothing out of place, and the pacing is pitch perfect. And I definitely feel that way about Grave of the Fireflies. I feel like every scene is where it should be. I feel like the film builds inside its framework beautifully. And as you know, it's, as they say in writing class, it's ghost framed. The very beginning of the story, you know that the two main characters are dead. The ghosts are actually guiding you through the story of their death. So as Takahata once joked in an interview, I thought the film would be a complete failure because there's no suspense. The story's already over when you start. The two main characters are dead. That's the beginning of the story. How do you then build a story after death? I was talking yesterday about apocalypse in Japanese storytelling and how so often the beginning of the film, classic example being Akira, it begins with the end, right? The world ends, and it's a neo-Tokyo. It's a neo-Japan. And even though it's a very different kind of film, Grave of the Fireflies essentially begins with the end. The kids are dead, the war is over, Japan is lost. And then you begin the story. So it's quite striking, and I have to say, some of you may know, the film is actually based on a short story or novella by a writer named Akiyuki Nosaka, who actually published the story in 1967. So it was 20 years later that Takahata picked up the story and adopted it for his film. The original story is quite moving, but is very, very different. It's a first-person account. It was written by Nosaka, as he said, to purge his guilt because his younger sister died of malnutrition at the end of the war. And in Nosaka's story, the boy, which we see as Seita in the film, basically eats all the food that his sister needs. And so he feels guilty for having effectively deprived his younger sister of nourishment. And he wrote the story to purge his guilt. Well, as you know, Takahata took it into a completely different dimension. But one fascinating aspect of many that Takahata brought to the film, aside from the ghosts telling the story, which is not in the original fiction, and aside from this really extraordinary portrait of a kind of selfishness. And Takahata said after the film was made that he thought Japanese people would be very angry at the film because it shows something that flies in the face of Japanese fantasies about themselves. The Japanese kind of sentimentality about being Japanese is that if you're Japanese, you will take care of each other. That's part of being Japanese, being born in Japan and being Japanese. Well, as you know, if you've seen the film, it doesn't happen. When people are really deprived of resources, they make decisions not to take care of people who are not immediate family. And one of the tragedies of the film, of course, is Seita, the boy, decides to leave his aunt out of pride and take care of his sister on his own, which he can't do. He can't do at all. So it's a film, you know, it's hard to if you think back to 1988, if some of you probably weren't born in 1988, but if you think back to 1988, this film comes out and was actually quite revolutionary in its accusatory tone, in showing the Japanese that they were indeed selfish when things were rough. And Takahata also said he felt that Seita was a selfish boy, a proud and selfish boy, and that he thought it would resonate with audiences in 1988 because from his point of view, Japanese had become selfish and proud. Remember, 1988 was the peak of the bubble era in Japan. People were making a lot of money, people had conveniences, people had real estate, they were suddenly rich. And from Takahata's perspective, they'd become very selfish and self-absorbed. So his portrait of Seita was a kind of accusation that he felt Japanese would recognize that we have become a selfish people. And from his perspective, Seita made the tragic mistakes that killed his sister. That Seita should have gone back to his aunt. And if you remember, there's a critical scene where a farmer tells him, son, you've got to go back to your aunt because you can't survive on your own out here. This is not the time to do something on your own. And he kind of, so it's almost an anti-hero story. It's almost an anti-Hollywood story. You know, do it alone, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Well, it doesn't work when everybody's poor and there are no resources. So it's in many respects a very harsh film. I'm going to show you this scene. I was lecturing this summer at a university in Tokyo called Waseda University, and I was teaching a class in media theory, and we were looking at anime, and I showed my class, the students were all Japanese, so we watched this film together, and they all said to me that they were seeing stuff they'd never seen before in the film. A lot of them had watched it when they were kids, so they just thought it was sad. And that's what you hear in America too, right? You mentioned Grave of the Fireflies, and people go, oh, it's so sad. But it's much more than a sad film. It's a film about society, it's a film about war, of course, also a film about sibling love, which is a rare thing to find in stories, a film that focuses on the unique relationships that brothers and sisters, or brothers and brothers, or sisters and sisters can have. That's very much the heart of this story. But it's also a film about class. So the clip, there's a long setup for this clip, but this clip that Helen selected is, I think it often gets overlooked when people watch the film, but it shows fairly well-off or wealthy or rich Japanese returning to their beautiful home in the countryside, which was not bombed. You know, the Americans bombed a lot of cities, 67 cities, but they didn't bomb the countryside. So there were a lot of places, if you were wealthy and you had a house in the country, just as you might if you were an American, have a house in Connecticut or have a house in the country, you didn't get bombed. And these rich children, women, return to their house. It's very, very revealing. Takahata puts them in Western dresses, so they're wearing Western dress. And it's also a flashpoint for a lot of Japanese to see that, because Japan fought and sacrificed for the emperor, and then when they lost the war, the government embraced the enemy, embraced the United States, and embraced the West, and adopted a lot of Western ways, which some Japanese felt like was a huge betrayal.
Although in a way, they were only going back to Japan in the 1860s and 1870s, when the whole country enthusiastically embraced Western ways. What the war did in both Japan and the West is it created a rupture in our visions of each other.
Yeah.
Whereas Japan had always thought of the West as, all right, a bit difficult to deal with, a bit rude, but they make great stuff and we can get on together. We'd always thought of Japan as, this cute little fairy-like kingdom full of these amazing people, but we got on together. In the war, we were suddenly demonizing each other for propaganda purposes. So for this to happen at the end of the war and in Takahata's movie was a huge shock for young people who'd never had that experience and lived through that feeling of suddenly you demonize people who had previously been your friends and your neighbors, which is very much the micro story as well as the macro story, isn't it?
Absolutely, and that's a good point. And as I said a few minutes ago, that this film punctures a lot of myths that Japanese have about themselves. And one of those myths, especially in the 80s, was that everyone was roughly equal. Everyone was middle class. That was Japan's sort of claim of pride, right? That everyone has enough money, everyone's middle class, we don't have poverty, we don't have inequality, and Takahata sort of flies in the face of that with this extraordinary scene, which I'll show you here. These are these rich kids coming home, and the music they're playing is a Western song, Home Sweet Home, and maximize this. The music is being played on a record player, an old RCA, what are they, Victographs they called those?
Victograph, I think they were.
Which would have been, you know, what? Phono. Yeah, so RCA phonograph, which would have been very hard to come by in post-war Japan. So clearly these are people of means. And then he very explicitly shifts the camera down to show Seita and Setsuko, their ghosts, playing hopscotch in the middle of the valley down on the floor. In the dirt, I should say. They're saying nothing's changed. It looks great. It looks beautiful.
And it does if you follow that path. It's stunning. Till you zoom in. What is so moving to me about this particularly is you can see how through the sequence of ghost flashbacks, Setsuko looks more ragged, dirtier, paler, thinner, then with flushed cheeks that show very, very ill health. You're watching this little girl repeating her death in front of your eyes while her better off countrymen are moving back into their house and putting on their Western frocks. And it must have been very difficult for Japanese audiences to see. We've actually got a whole pile of clips for Takahata to show you, but we've just had a 15-minute call. So shall we look at the trailer for Pompoko? No, actually, let's look at the trailer for Pompoko, not the balls clip. Although that's fun. I don't know, do you want to see the balls clip? It's a short one, and then we might look at the Yamadas. But this is how Tanuki, transforming raccoon dogs, fight the Japanese police. And trust me, it works better than giant robots. Tanuki folklore says that they can do almost anything with their testicles. Kamikaze balls.
I think that was cut out of the original U.S. release.
Yes, it was. Pompoko is an unbelievable fantasy about what it means to be invaded and have your home taken from you, what it means to have rural communities degraded by the spread of the suburbs, and what it means ecologically as well to native Japanese wildlife. But mostly, it's a movie about dispossession and about how when you're being dispossessed, you can either assimilate or fight back, and how if you fight back, you will lose. Takahata's not a downbeat filmmaker, as you can see, there's a lot of fun in that, but he's very clear-eyed about what one can do to resist the movement of society towards selfishness. What one can do is limited, and what one is unlikely to do is succeed. But what one ought to do is resist with every ounce of one's strength, and that's never in doubt in Takahata's movies, is it? It's really that...
No, and do you mind if I show one more clip?
Please do.
I want to show one more clip from Grave of the Fireflies, because it's something that it's the final closing of the film, and a lot of people don't notice how it actually ends. Everybody knows, of course, it ends with Setsuko's death, but it also ends with a scene of the two ghosts reuniting. He actually takes you back to the opening scene, which you can see on the screen, which is where Setsuko rises in a field and the fireflies rise around her. So the ghost kind of rises from a crouch and Seita sees her. And then it places them on a bench. Does anybody remember this scene?
Yeah.
They're sitting on a
my
bench.
Heart every time.
The bench still exists. There's a bench on a hillside above the town of Kobe, and you can go to it, and now there's a plaque there saying this is dedicated to Seita and Setsuko of Grave of the Fireflies. But watch what rises in front of them. Some of you may have noticed this before, but my Japanese students hadn't realized what happens when they sit on the bench. The camera's rising behind them, and what you see in the valley is a complete anachronism, because these ghosts have died in World War II in 1945, and the city in front of them is contemporary Kobe, with skyscrapers floating above. And it's something that my Japanese students were really taken by. They hadn't noticed it so clearly before.
They expected Kobe to be there,
to
and
look
they
like
knew
that.
what Kobe looked like.
But of course, Kobe didn't look like that in 1945. So what is the decision Takahata is making is to show you a modern, developed Japan in front of these two ghosts who perished in World War II.
To show you essentially the city that was built on their bones.
And one of the things I asked the Japanese kids was, what do you think, why do you think he did that? And some of them said, I think it's, to show that we should never forget those two kids. They're still there, the ghosts of the war. And some students said, I think it's a critique of Japan that turned into this hyper-developed machine after the war and deliberately forgot what actually happened to Japan at that time just 40 years earlier. So it's a striking scene, and again, I just wanted to follow up what you said about him being clear-eyed.
Yes,
like he does not, he doesn't let you off easy, Takahata, whatever the story is.
And yet, he also had this enormous sense of fun. He had a sense that you had to catch the moments of joy wherever you could find them, because there were going to be more than enough moments that didn't have joy in them. And I wish we had time to show you the rest of the clips we've got, because one of his films that I really, really rate is My Neighbors the Yamadas, which I often wonder if he named that in a deliberate challenge to My Neighbor Totoro. Yeah. Because it's a magic realist movie with... Could we just run through that? And I think we just about got time. We should finish at 10:02, but we've got time to do this.
If anybody has any questions, I guess.
So at the time it was made and for some time after, the most technically advanced computer animation ever made in Japan. To emulate the style of the original mangaka, Ghibli devised a series of programs that would enable you to watercolor fade on screen. And the technical accomplishment of this cannot be overrated. It's impossible to do without technology. Since they did it, of course, everybody else has acquired the technology, but this really was a huge innovation. And Takahata was passionately interested in doing something that nobody would notice, but that was there in the manga. Okay, questions?
Yeah, questions.
Any questions?
Have questions about Takahata or Ghibli or Miyazaki or the whole kit?
Yes, indeed.
Like a lot of his works just like progress away from 1995. I imagine if he was like 80 in 2018 that he was somewhat affected by that, right? Obviously.
Oh yeah.
Watching Great Firefly. But what was really, they say when we look at post-war Japanese media that they obviously are clearly influenced by some sort of crisis. Do you know if Miyazaki was influenced by a lot of any crisis? Because he's obviously very much an environmentalist.
Oh yeah, but both Miyazaki and Takahata talk about the experience of seeing places bombed when they were very small children, of having to leave their homes as very small children and facing up to crisis, of family members disappearing, of people, friends having family who died. So they were both, like everybody in Japan. There was nobody in Japan, even those young ladies in their Western frocks, who escaped the impact of the war. There was not a single family in Japan who didn't lose somebody.
Also, I should mention, it's a good question, that a lot of people don't realize this, which is in the book, the Grave of the Fireflies and My Neighbor Totoro were made at the same time, 1987, 1988. They were released as a double feature.
I love to imagine people go to
At the time, Japanese cinemas, movie theaters, did not trust animation to bring in audiences. So in 1988, if you went to see an animated film, you paid for one ticket and you saw two. You got a double feature. Well, the first film was Grave of the Fireflies, and nobody stayed for the second. They were in tears.
And the popcorn sales went right down, too.
Yeah, and so Mr. Suzuki, as Helen has pointed out, who is a very smart business manager, very quickly contacted the cinemas and had them reverse the order so that Totoro was shown first and Grave was shown second. But there's a deeper relationship between the two films, which is that Takahata and Miyazaki both set themselves a challenge, which was to create an animated film that somehow, in some way, referred to their experiences in World War II. In Takahata's case, obviously Grave embraces it entirely, and also is related to his own experience in the firebombing campaigns. Miyazaki, who, like many children of wealthy families, his family was very well-to-do. In fact, ironically, as many of you may know, his uncle worked for a company named Miyazaki Airplane, and they designed the Zero fighter planes used in the war. So Miyazaki had this internal conflict of knowing that some of his money, his family's money, came from weaponry, came from making war machines. Miyazaki refers to the film very directly in the war very directly in the beginning of Totoro, in a way that Japanese audiences of a certain generation would recognize immediately. And if you remember the opening scene of the father driving a kind of jalopy, like a rundown old car, out-of-date car, falling apart, well, that would be the kind of car you could find with money if you lived in Tokyo or a city during the war. You couldn't find a nice, shiny new Toyota because they were using all the steel, all the machinery for weapons, right? So you'd only find junky old cars. So he's driving a jalopy. And if you look at the kids, Mei-chan, if you look at their clothing, it's ill-fitting clothes. It doesn't fit, it's not fashionable, some stuff's too big or too short, and that would indicate to a certain audience in Japan that those were hand-me-downs, or even grimmer, might have been clothing that were taken off the dead and used and given to the children to wear. So those two, immediately, those two details would signify to an audience of, for example, my mother's Japanese, her generation would see that and think, that's a family escaping the city during the war and getting out to the countryside. Obviously, the mother is ill, so there's all this other back stuff, but just visually, Miyazaki is showing you this is World War II.
But also, of course, in a way, it was a slightly unfair challenge because Miyazaki was born in 41. So he was very, very young throughout World War II. And I suppose Takahata thought, because he was born 5 years earlier, he remembered more of it, we'll set him something he's really going to have to work on. But Miyazaki cleverly sidestepped it by just slipping in that little reference and then moving off into realms of fantasy. So you can see why the two of them were so combative with each other and why they were in many ways each other's intellectual match and really powerful. One more question I think we've got time for, if there is one. Yeah.
And he had an anecdote about the death of Kondo.
Yeah.
Saying how he said it was, he said the person's name was Eslan. Eslan said that Takahata was responsible for his death, but Takahata not in his pedigree.
Yeah.
Do you think that will change the way we see this film? Or is that going to be a situation where we have to?
Oh, that's a great question. That is a really great question. Essentially, Suzuki has a book out, which Roland and I were talking about earlier, in which he tells a story, which remember he's telling this after Takahata's death, that a staff member at Ghibli directly blamed Takahata for the death of Kondo-san, for working him to death. Leaving aside the fact that Kondo-san was a highly intelligent 40-year-old who presumably made some of his own choices in the matter, Suzuki's bringing this up in a book published just after Takahata's death, and it's a really interesting question because it's kind of a Me Too moment. The question was, should the fact that some people don't regard Takahata as a particularly nice person affect how we see his films? Now, this is always going to be subjective. I accept that this is always going to be subjective. I watch films by many directors whose work I admire magnificently, but whom I would not choose to invite to dinner or introduce friends to. I absolutely adore most of the work of Roman Polanski. I would not introduce any of my friends to Roman Polanski.
Especially not young ones.
especially not young female one, I deeply admire the work of Alfred Hitchcock. None of my blonde friends would ever get to go to dinner with Alfred Hitchcock. So my answer would be no. I don't think that the fact that Takahata put art above everything else would make me hesitate to enjoy his films. But also, I think we have to consider with everything that Suzuki does, with everything that any marketing person does, the timing of revelations and the way in which those revelations are made. Because things are said which may not be strictly untrue, but which may not be as the context presents them. What would your view be, Roland?
Well, there's a broader picture here, which is that the animators of Takahata's generation, Miyazaki's generation, Shigeru Mizuki, some of you may know, he just died 2 years ago, created Kitaro.
At 92?
Gegege no Kitaro.
Wow.
He was 92 years old. Actually, Tezuka, had he not died at 60 in 1989, might
Probably
be around.
still be
He might
working,
be around
yeah.
today. He died very early, and a lot of people say it was karoshi. He worked himself to death.
He would have been 90 this year.
My broader point is when you talk to artists of that generation, you know, they were on the front lines. Japan didn't have an animation industry. They built it, and they built it working very, very hard with no money. And, you know, Miyazaki told me stories about how when they first opened Ghibli, they used to pile into a truck. It got so cold, they didn't have heating in their studio. It got so cold that they'd finally reach a point where their fingers were so cold they couldn't draw. And once they reached that point where the drawing was being affected, they would stop and they would pile into a truck, and drive to an izakaya, which was down. Izakaya is like a Japanese pub, right? You know, cheap foods, cheap drinks. And they would drive to this izakaya. He said it took a while. It wasn't close by. It wasn't the Tokyo of now where there's a convenience store on every corner, and 2 on every corner. But back then, they had to drive to this little hovel where this woman had an izakaya, and they would, you know, scarf down their food, very cheap food, and warm up at the izakaya, and then go back to the studio and draw until their hands got too cold, and do it again. I'm not trying to, you know, lionize those guys, but they worked really, really hard. And so, you know, when I talk to Miyazaki about the younger generation of animators and how they're poorly paid, and they have to work so hard, and they don't make enough money to get their own apartments, he was totally unsympathetic.
Yeah.
He said, "Of course, they're lucky." He said, we didn't have studios back then.
Yep.
We just had little rooms. We froze.
Kids today don't know they're born.
So those guys, first of all, don't have a lot of sympathy for young animators who complain that they're not making enough money to get their own apartments in Tokyo, because those guys all lived together, right? They would just share one room together, and they would often sleep at the studio, right? And secondly, I think the kind of perfection I mentioned earlier, which is a strange word to use with art of any form, because I believe in James Joyce's dictum, which is perfect imperfection, right, is what makes art. But the exquisiteness of Takahata's work, the pacing, the use of music, the way he tells a story, Kaguya Hime, Princess Kaguya, is like that to me. It's like a scroll painting come to life. It's extraordinary, an artistic achievement. And I think he had to ride people pretty hard to achieve that. And, you know, you saw the films Helen put up there. He didn't make that many films. It took him a long time to make a film. He wasn't like Miyazaki, cranking them out, you know, scooping his Oscar, and, you know. I'm not diminishing Miyazaki, but Miyazaki is much more, you know, responsive to deadlines and to publicity, and he flies to L.A. I mean, Takahata, I was told, frankly hated coming to the U.S., but loved Europe. So he would go to any festival in Europe. Steve told me that, Steve Huppert. He was like,
Annecy, I'll go.
He said even if it was a tiny festival in Denmark, if they sent an invitation, Takahata would go, I'll go, because he loved visiting Europe. So he was, as Helen said in the very beginning, you know, you saw that picture of him looking off camera, he was a man of his own.
He was interested
in
what he did. Yeah.
He did it the way he did it, and you had to live with that. I think Grave of the Fireflies is as close to perfection as you can probably get in an animated film, and maybe in a film in general. It's just, to me, exquisite. I mean, note for note for note, scene for scene. Nothing's out of place.
I think also when you look at art, it is foolish to expect it to be nice. It may look nice. It's foolish to expect it to be nice in every aspect of its creation. We would all like our favorite artists to be great people, but I only require them to be great artists. I have enough great people in my life, thank you. I don't need Isao Takahata to become so nice that his films change, because I don't need him that way. Perhaps Mrs. Takahata would prefer it that way. But I only need him as an artist. And for my money, whatever kind of human being he was, I'm happy to detach the person from the art and say he was a very, very great artist. And also remember that someone who is notoriously picky and notoriously difficult and doesn't make friends easily thought he was the greatest man he'd ever met.
Miyazaki, right.
So Miyazaki's view of Takahata as a person, I think, goes a long way to balancing the scales of anyone who maybe resented Takahata at work might happen. But I'm afraid we have to go now.
We're out of time, but one more thing I just want to mention, because we haven't actually addressed it, in case anybody's confused. Takahata never was a draftsman.
Nope, never.
He's not an illustrator. He doesn't illustrate any of his films. He's a director.
And a writer.
So, and a writer. So, I mean, to some extent, maybe he was a little less sympathetic to the artists he worked with and drove them really hard because he had the vision of what he wanted to see, but he wasn't drawing.
Yeah.
That's very different. Miyazaki's drawing, right? Miyazaki's down there in the gutter actually illustrating the scenes. Takahata was a visionary. He was a director.
If you think about it, to Takahata, artists were pencils.
Yeah.
They were just putting his vision on the screen. Do you worry about sharpening a pencil? And I think it could be as simple as that. These are my tools. I need them to make this film. I will make them work as well as I can make them work. A lot of directors take that decision, and they produce great films for us. We don't question them too much unless somebody says something inconvenient at a funeral, which is later reported by somebody who has a book to sell.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thanks a lot for coming. Thank you, Helen.
Thank you.